Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. If you're someone who loves discovering the hidden mechanics of how truly great organizations rise and fall, well, you are in the perfect place. Today, we're setting the stage for a really unique comparative analysis. We're going to dive into the historical data, the foundational sources, and the timelines of two vastly different organizations, and we're going to map them directly onto each other. On one hand, we've got an ancient transcontinental empire, and on the other, modern corporate giants. Think of the foundational stumbles of Nokia, or for today's deep dive, Apple in the absolutely pivotal year of 1985. The historical parallels we're going to unpack here will completely change how you view leadership and power. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this with a totally mind-bending question. What exactly does a 6th century nomadic empire share with a 1980s tech giant? Now, on the surface, it feels like absolutely nothing, right? I mean, one faction rode horses across the vast, freezing Eurasian steppe, completely mastering mounted archery. The other, they sat in a sweltering California garage, soldering circuit boards to change personal computing forever. The environments literally couldn't be more alien to one another. But as you'll see, human nature, the ego, the ambition, the raw instinct for self-preservation is the ultimate constant. Consider the first Turkic Khaganate, founded in 552 CE. This wasn't just some small tribe. It became the first truly Central Asian transcontinental empire. To put its massive scale into perspective for you, its borders stretched all the way from the edges of Manchuria in the east directly to the shores of the Black Sea in the west. It was an absolute geopolitical juggernaut. Now contrast that with Apple Computer, specifically looking at the year 1985. The Macintosh had just recently launched, putting a massive cultural and technological dent in the universe. Apple was, undeniably, the rising jewel of Silicon Valley. Yet the unexpected parallel we're exploring today is that the mechanics of internal power struggles remain exactly identical, whether they're playing out in the sprawling valleys of the Central Asian steppe or behind the closed doors of a corporate boardroom. Both of these massive, history-making entities were brought to the very brink of total collapse, not by outside competitors, but entirely by internal division.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to structure this journey in 5 clear steps. First, we'll look at the rise of empires. Second, the catalysts for the crisis. Third, factions fighting and fallout. Fourth, losing the core identity. And finally, we'll look at the ultimate price of division.
Section 1. The rise of empires, visionary duos.
Before we can truly understand how these organizations broke apart, we have to look at how they were built in the first place. And it's fascinating to realize that both of these empires were forged by highly complementary visionary pairs, like two pieces of a puzzle. The Göktürk Empire was established by two formidable brothers, Bumin and Istami. Bumin provided the sheer, unrelenting military force, famously revolting against their oppressive Ruran overlords in 552 and claiming supremacy. Meanwhile, his brother Istami acted as the master diplomat and the expansionist of the West. He was the guy out there securing massive, world-altering alliances with the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Now shift that exact dynamic over to Apple. Apple was built by the iconic duo of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak provided the raw, quiet engineering genius, sitting at a workbench literally making the impossible possible. Jobs, on the other hand, brought the fierce business vision, the aggressive marketing, and that uncompromising design aesthetic. Both empires were built entirely from scratch by two people whose radically different skills interlocked to form a perfect, unstoppable whole.
Moving on to Section 2. Catalysts for the crisis. The tipping point.
You know, no empire just falls overnight. There's always a critical moment when the foundational structures begin to crack under immense pressure. For the Göktürks, that violent tipping point arrived in 581 CE, when Taspar Khan, the fourth ruler of the empire, died. Now, in nomadic empires, succession wasn't just a simple, guaranteed transition from a king to his eldest son. It relied on a highly volatile system of lateral succession and some really intense negotiation among the ruling elite. So, Taspar's sudden death left a massive, gaping power vacuum. This sudden absence of a single unifying leader instantly strained the entire Khaganate, plunging the strongest, most ambitious figures in the realm into a bitter, chaotic competition for the throne. Now, let's pivot to Apple's tipping point. While the Göktürks lost their leader to death, Apple was actively losing faith in theirs simply due to sheer temperament. As this quote from our foundational sources points out, Steve Jobs famously pushed people too hard, rubbed people the wrong way, and burned bridges left and right. Think about how wild that is for a second. A founder actively marginalizing himself in the very empire he built. Despite his undeniable genius during the Macintosh era, Apple's board pushed back hard on his ambitions to be CEO because, frankly, they were terrified of his autocratic style. They wanted conventional, predictable stability. This intense corporate anxiety led them to bring in PepsiCo executive John Sculley in 1983, specifically to provide what they literally called adult supervision for their visionary founder.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the wildly complex web of factions that instantly emerged for the Göktürks the second that stability evaporated. You've got four powerful rival claimants fighting for control. First is Amrak, the son. He was briefly appointed but quickly abdicated under the intense pressure. Then you have Appa. Taspar actually willed the throne directly to him before dying. But the High Council of Nobles, the Kurultai, decided to completely overrule the dead king's explicitly stated wishes and appointed a third claimant, Ishbara, instead. Meanwhile, Tardu, who is out commanding the Western Khaganate, watched this whole political circus unfold and decided he just didn't want to take orders from the East anymore. The council's audacious decision to ignore the founder's will instantly shattered the empire, turning former brothers-in-arms into warring factions. Look at how rapidly this escalation occurs in both timelines. It is almost an eerie synchronization. In 581, a sudden death triggers the Göktürk succession crisis. Just 2 years later, in our parallel timeline, 1983 sees Apple hire John Sculley, fundamentally altering the power dynamic and planting the seeds of their own crisis. By 584, the political debate on the steppe completely breaks down into violence as Ishbara physically attacks Appa's territory. And right on pace, in 1985, Apple's boardroom boils over. Jobs and Sculley clash aggressively, literally screaming at each other over the failed sales projections of the Lisa and Macintosh computers. In both of these histories, it took barely 3 years to go from foundational strain to total uncompromising civil war. Section 3. Factions, Fighting, and Fallout. And this brilliantly illustrates the climax. This is where the governing bodies, whether we're talking about the ancient Kurultai Council or the modern corporate board, make their decisive, dividing moves. It played out as a sequential boardroom brawl that ultimately ousted Apple's visionary founder. Step 1. The flagship products fail to meet Wall Street's sky-high expectations. Step 2. John Sculley makes a deeply controversial move and strips Jobs of his operational control over his beloved Macintosh project. Step 3. Jobs is absolutely furious, organizing a behind-the-scenes corporate power play to orchestrate a coup and oust Sculley. But Step 4. The board steps in. When forced to choose, they side with the conventional CEO. Jobs is stripped of all power, either fired or forced to quit, depending on whose historical account you read. Either way, the visionary was officially out. What is absolutely crucial to understand here is how these factions sought safety when the pressure hit its absolute peak. On the steppe, the Göktürk ruler Ishbara felt so threatened by his internal rival Appa that he actually allied with the Chinese Sui dynasty for protection. I mean, think about the gravity of that for a second. He gave up his empire's independence, bowing to a foreign power, just to win a domestic political fight. Over in California, Apple's board sided with the conventional, safe CEO John Sculley, seeking corporate protection against their own volatile founder. In both cases, the desperate pursuit of consensus and safety actively fractured the original, unifying systems that made the organizations great in the first place. Section 4. Losing the core identity. So, what actually happens when an organization completely loses its foundational compass? When the visionaries are gone or when leaders compromise their core values just to survive the week? Well, for the Göktürks, the cultural and strategic consequences were nothing short of devastating. Certain Turkic lords actually began abandoning their traditional names in favor of Chinese ones just to appease their new protectors. There were even high-level debates about adopting Buddhism and settling down in walled cities. This is incredible because a nomadic warrior culture relies entirely on its mobility. Settling in cities completely stripped them of their core military advantage. It's like a shark deciding to stop swimming. Furthermore, they developed a crippling economic reliance on Chinese silk, entirely weakening their self-sufficiency. Because of their deep internal divisions, they became incredibly susceptible to manipulation by the Tang and Sui dynasties, who easily and happily played the divided factions against one another. Drawing that exact parallel over to Apple, we see a company entering a deep, dark wilderness. Without Steve Jobs' relentless vision and obsessive focus, Apple wandered strategically for an entire decade under conventional leadership.
They produced highly confusing, overlapping product lines. They completely lost their sharp, rebellious edge in the market, basically becoming just another beige box computer company struggling to compete. In fact, our sources note that CEO John Sculley later openly admitted he simply lacked the experience back in 1985 to recognize Jobs' crucial role as a visionary architect. Without that unique identity driving them forward, Apple was entirely adrift, burning through cash and losing immense market share.
Section 5. The price of division. Actions have consequences, and factionalism eventually exacts a massive toll. For the first Turkic Kaghanate, the division was literally fatal. The empire permanently split into the eastern and western Kaghanates. Weakened, divided, and totally devoid of their original unified strength, both halves were entirely conquered and subjugated by Tang China by the year 657. Total, irreversible collapse. Apple, on the other hand, survived, but only barely. After being ousted, Steve Jobs went on to found Next, a high-end computer company. Meanwhile, Apple's stock tanked, and the company floundered so badly that in 1996, facing a terrifying near-death experience and potential bankruptcy, they were forced to buy Next for an astounding $429 million. They paid almost $500 million just to bring Jobs back and save the very company he created.
Which brings us to a final question I want you to take with you today. Whether you look at a majestic nomadic empire sweeping across the Asian steppe or a modern Silicon Valley titan reshaping technology, the lesson is exactly the same. Internal division, unchecked egos, and a profound loss of identity are far, far more dangerous than any external enemy you will ever face. So take a hard look at your own teams, your own companies, your own leadership structures. Is your organization's board prioritizing long-term survival and vision, or are they just comfortably managing egos while the walls close in? Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I really hope this deep dive sparked your curiosity as much as it did mine. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.